So this is about the section 4.6, political democracy and economic development in India, 1967 to 1990. During this period, caste, ethnicity, and religion played a more significant role. And in the earlier period, that is 1947 to 1967, in the previous video, we spoke about a consensus between the political democracy and the economic development or the economics of welfareism. There was a consensus. This consensus was broken during this period with with significantly two factors. One, there's a rise of social group, a new social group or groups, and these social groups were earlier on the margins, but then they were now empowered with a political voice, and they started asking their economic claims. This is factor number one. Another important factor is there's a rise of second generation political leadership, which lacked legitimacy or acceptance or charisma. So these two factors, one, the social groups on the margins gaining power. Number two is the rise of second generation leadership without any legitimacy or acceptance or charisma. So these two factors led to the breaking of consensus. This led to the government adopting a policy of mediation and reconciliation, which later had a long-term political and economic consequences. During this period, 1967 to 1990, we observed that there is a lot of discontentment among the people for various reasons. Number one, there's non-fulfillment because of non-fulfillment of election promises and there was high expectations. Number two, there's a rise in the level of poverty. The poverty rose from between 1957 to 1970. The poverty rose from 34% to 57%. And third reason is that there is a food crisis, which is termed as ship-to-mouth existence, which is almost like whatever is consumed is being imported. And finally, there's a devaluation of rupee. So the value of Indian rupee had to be reduced. So these are the four factors which led to a lot of discontentment among people. What are they? Let's revise. Number one, there is non-fulfillment of promises and expectations. Number two, there is a rise in the level of poverty, 34% in 1957 to 57% in 1970. It's easy to remember. Then third, there's a food crisis that is termed as ship-to-mouth existence. Ship, that is import, to mouth existence. Third, there is a devaluation of rupee. So these four factors caused a lot of discontentment among people. As a consequence of this, we see that the planning was suspended for 3 years. And then there's a regionalization and localization. There's a regionalization and ruralization of Indian politics. Yogendra Yadav termed this as a second democratic upsurge. So we've seen 3 points and the consequences. The fourth point is there's a rise of dominant caste-rich peasantry. So there's a rise of dominant caste-rich peasantry, such as Jats, Yadavs, Kammas, Kapus, and Reddys. So these dominant caste-rich peasantry, they started asking for their share of benefits from the economic policies, and they also sought the mobility in the political process. So we've seen 4 consequences. One, the political planning. The planning which was being carried out so far was suspended for 3 years. Number 2, there's regionalization and ruralization of Indian politics. Indian politics was being taken into the grassroots. And number 3, there is a comment by Yogendra Yadav which says there's a second democratic upsurge that is taking place during this time. And finally, there is a rise of dominant caste-rich peasantry, such as Jats, Kammas, Kapus, Reddys, and Yadavs. So they started asking for their share of benefits from the economic policies, or they also started asking for upward mobility in the political process. And after this section deals with 3 different regimes, political regimes. I've just divided for the sake of convenience. One is the Congress led by Indira Gandhi. Second is the Janata government, and third is Congress by Rajiv Gandhi. So we'll deal with this one by one. The first Congress, there's a strong renewed emphasis on agriculture. We've seen in earlier video that the more emphasis during the period of 1947 to 1967, there was more emphasis on heavy industries rather than agriculture, because they believe that any investment in agriculture will have lesser returns. Unlike that, now the Congress had given more strong and renewed emphasis on the agriculture. Number two, there's a populist rhetoric that was going on during this time. So there was a lot of sloganeering, nationalization of banks, and abolition of private purses. There is number three. There is a dissent and regionalism within the Congress. So within the Congress itself, there is a lot of dissent and regionalism, and this was held. This was dealt by the High Command using divide and rule. So all of these resulted in point number four, that is the emergency. Emergency was seen as lack of cohesion among the dominant coalition, and also a lack of institutional mechanisms. Institutional mechanisms which were in place, they were not being followed. So these are the 4 points in the Congress under Indira Gandhi. Next, there's Janata government that is elected. So the very election of Janata government was seen as the sagacity. It was seen to depict the sagacity of Indian electorate, and it also indicated the embedding of democratic spirit in the imagination of Indian people. So finally, they believe that Indians understood democracy when they voted out the Congress. Um then there is a failure of, but the Janata government was eventually kicked out immediately. Not the word kicked out. Immediately, the Janata government was elected out, and this was seen as a failure of this failure was attributed to the fact that the coalition politics will be limited if there is a lack of any ideological unity or purpose. So this explains the second regime. Now, finally, moving on to the second Congress regime, or the one after the Janata, which is majorly driven by Rajiv Gandhi. So here again, the populism and patronage was brought back. There's proliferation of subsidies again, which led to a massive state expenditure, and also there's loss of revenue for the state. Lots of soft loans were being given, and also there's loan waivers that were being given, and there's a centralization of political power that was taking place. However, there's some good things also happening. There's employment generation programs that were started, National Rural Employment Programs, IRDP. So all this was happening under Congress too. But it is seen that there's a lot of money and muzzle factor that was being brought into the elections. So there is a concept that was developed during this time called the vote contractor, as termed by Rajni Kothari. So the electoral arena is now dominated by money as muzzle. So who has the money will make it through the elections. So this explains the period of the political democracy and economic development in India during the 1967 to 1990 phase. So this phase once again, this phase majorly dominated by caste, ethnicity, and religion. That's it for this video.